We're going to be working up a version of this shot of X-Wings flying past, which is based on this shot from the 1997 special edition of A New Hope, which is based on these two shots from 1977. What we're not going to be doing is... I'm using this 3D model of a spaceship. You can find all kinds of awesome models of movie and TV spaceships all over sites like sci-fi3d.com and foundation3d.com. This model I then duplicated out using the particle simulator to create an entire fleet. Changing the animation of the main hero ships then propagates out into the fleet, which is kind of neat. The planets were made using a mixture of fractal and sphere effects. We've got a whole separate bonus video talking about those, so head over there if you want to know more. It's worth mentioning that all of this stuff is just using the built-in effects in HitFilm 4 Pro. It doesn't require any extra plugins. Because visual effects are all a trick, and as long as you're doing what you need to do to make the trick work, well, that's good enough. So, to begin with, that star field. There are lots of different techniques for making star fields in HitFilm. Using atomic particles is a particularly neat technique, which also renders quite fast and gives you lots of creative control. To start with, create a new white plane. I made it 2048 by 2048, so it's a nice high-resolution square. Onto this plane, I'll add an atomic particle effect. Now, atomic effects create an array of particles in a grid pattern, and I can use the fractal controls to now warp that grid into a new shape. I'm going to ramp the displace strength all the way up, which alters the pattern like scrunching up a piece of paper. I'll also put iterations up to 20, which intensifies the overall fractal effect. And playing with the wavelength creates a wide range of different results, depending on the look you're going for. Star Wars tends to have quite clean, classic star fields without much clumping of stars together. One thing you have to make sure you do is drop the speed down to 0, otherwise your stars are going to move about like crazy. In particle appearance, I'll put the size and opacity random properties up to max, so that the stars don't all look the same size. These stars are currently a bit too big, so I'm going to increase the size fractal option as well. And then the last thing is to go into the number of particles and just tweak it to get the look you want. I'm going to drop it down to about 300 by 300. But again, it kind of depends what sort of specific starfield look you're going for. And we now have a nice, cool starfield texture. We can come back in here to tweak the look of it at any point. Right now, though, it's just a flat 2D image. To turn it into a wraparound starfield that moves with our camera, I'm going to use the Environment Map Viewer effect. This wraps the layer onto the inside of a sphere, which works brilliantly for this kind of thing. I'll drop the scale property down to 50%. If I now add a 3D camera, you can see that I can now look and pan around in any direction, and that starfield just works as you'd expect. I've already brought in my X-Wing, and it's ready to go in the media panel. So I'll drag it from the media panel down onto the timeline. By switching into a 3-panel view, I can then position the ship where I want it at the start of the shot. In the ship's world transform properties, I'll activate position keyframing, then move forward about 10 seconds and move the ship forwards and up a bit so that it flies past the camera. Once that's done, I can then animate the camera to pan around with the ship. Because this scene is set up in 3D, you have a lot of freedom over what you do with your camera, but I'm going to basically go for the same kind of shot from the Star Wars Special Edition. Okay, if your model has animation groups, you'll find them under the Models section of the layer. For this shot, I animated the wings on the spaceship. One thing to note is that when you bring in a model, the anchor point for groups might not always be in the right place. So if I try rotating a wing, you can see that it's pivoting around the middle, rather than on the joint. To fix this, you can go in and adjust the anchor point. In this case, I can just adjust the anchor point's X position. Once that's done, I can then put that same value into the position X property to move the wing back to its correct location. If I now go to rotate it, it does exactly what I want. I can now keyframe this to animate open. Skipping forwards, here's the finished ship, all animated and with the camera following it. Creating additional ships is now really easy. I can simply select the model in the Models group and then duplicate it. You can then position the duplicate somewhere new. I did this a couple of times, and each ship inherits that same animation. Of course, you can go in and tweak the animation for each ship so that they do something slightly different if you want. For lighting, I positioned an orange light up at the same position as the planet. This I set to be a direction light, which works well for large light sources like a sun or a gas giant. I also set its colour to be a similar orange to the planet. If you look at both the 97 Special Edition and the 77 original, the huge orange planet doesn't really affect the lighting of the scene at all, which is actually a little bit weird. This creates a pretty extreme look, so I used an ambient light as a fill so that we can see more of the model. The ambient light's intensity can be adjusted to achieve the desired look. Ambient light falls equally on all surfaces of the model and has no actual position in 3D space. I actually ended up duplicating the orange direction light to give it even more intensity. Sometimes in visual effects shots it doesn't hurt to have the lighting bloom out, as it reduces the perfect appearance of computer-generated images. For the particle simulation of the larger fleet, it's actually relatively simple. First I created a large cube emitter positioned behind the hero ships. Then in the particle system's appearance properties, I set it to use the 3D model layer and set the animation to last for the desired number of frames. In movement, I set the speed down to 0, because we don't want the actual individual particles having their own speed. All the animation is coming from the hero ships. The lifetime needs to be increased as well, because you don't want those ships disappearing just after 1 second. In appearance, I set the color source to texture color. This means the particle ships will all have the same lighting as the source 3D models. To ensure that the ships aren't going to appear on top of each other, I used the new grid emitter option, which makes sure that particles have some distance between them because they can only spawn according to a grid pattern. The grid density can be adjusted, so I reduced it down to make sure there was adequate spacing between each of the spawned ships. We don't want the ships randomly appearing mid-shot, so in the particle system's general properties, I can go to frame 0 and turn keyframing on for the active property. I then move forward 2 frames and disable it. This means that ships only spawn right at the start of that layer. The number of ships that appear can then be adjusted using the particles per second. You can shift the whole layer left 1 frame to hide that initial appearance if needed. Let's work on some more lighting effects. I'm going to add a grade layer on top of everything, which we can then use to grade the entire shot. First up, I'm going to go with the light streaks effect. This creates sparkly highlights around bright areas of your frame. It's highly customizable and very much a style-based thing. I want to keep it relatively subtle, so I'm going to set it to a screen blend and a size of about 50. The threshold is used to determine how bright a pixel has to be before generating a streak. After this, I'll add the anamorphic light flares effect. I'm going to change the streak type to horizontal, drop the length right down and turn off the pivots. This keeps the anamorphic streaking localized around bright areas, and I'll boost up the blur and drop the intensity. Again, the result is subtle, but it goes a long way towards a more naturalistic camera. This kind of post-processing is all about adding the stuff that you get for free if you're shooting something real. It's the kind of unexpected glitches you get when you're shooting through a real lens. For the initial grade, I used a LUT, added to a new grade layer on top. When applied to neutral footage, LUTs can be very useful for applying a quick grade, or to simulate the appearance of a particular film stock. I'm using a Kodak LUT, which you can download for free. Check the link in the video description for details. It adds saturation and contrast while constraining the overall palette, and the result is a far more filmic dynamic range, although it is a bit too intense. This can be easily adjusted by simply changing the opacity of the grade layer, which in turn shifts the strength of the LUT. And finally, I used another grade layer and a color wheels effect to drop the saturation down a touch, and then I slapped on the letterbox effect to create a 235:1 ratio. So that's a lot of different techniques we've just covered in this tutorial, but hopefully it's also shown how it's really